In the spring of 1991, every cattle rancher in Calhoun County, Texas, laughed at Irene Marsh. They laughed at the co-op feed store on Highway 35 in Port Lavaca. They laughed at the cattle auction in Edna. They laughed at the Wednesday morning coffee table at Dottie's Diner on Commerce Street, where the older ranchers gathered before the heat came up and sat in the same 4 booths they had sat in for 30 years. $40 on, the Marsh woman had driven to a soil science conference in College Station 4 hours north and had come home with a truck bed full of comfrey crowns wrapped in wet burlap, curtains on, and she was going to plant them along the fence lines of her beef cattle pastures. Not in a garden, not in a medicinal plot behind the house. Along the fence lines of 3 working pastures, 41 Angus and Angus Cross cattle grazed from sunup to the afternoon shade. The ranchers had a word for what Irene was doing. They called it going soft. It was not a kind word in Calhoun County. Irene Geraldine Marsh was 43 years old in the spring of 1991, and she had grown up on the same 112-acre property outside Seadrift that she was now running alone. The 3rd generation of her family to raise cattle on that particular stretch of coastal prairie, 18 miles from the Gulf. Her father, Horace, had sold her the operation in 1984 when his knees had given out, and he had moved into the small guest house at the back of the property, and had watched her run it. Ever since, with the particular silence of a man who had raised his daughter to make her own decisions and was not about to start second-guessing them now. Her husband, Kenneth Marsh, had died in January of 1989 of a heart attack. He had been 51, $300. He had been driving back from the feed store in Edna with 4 bags of range cubes in the truck bed when it happened, and the truck had drifted onto the shoulder and stopped against a cedar fence post, and the highway patrol had found him there at 7 in the evening when the rancher who owned that fence post had called to report a vehicle. Irene had gotten the call at 8:15, $40 on. She had been in the milking barn, though they did not run a dairy, checking the water lines that Kenneth had been meaning to repair since October. The community had handled the death the way communities in coastal Texas handle the deaths of their own. People came. They brought food. They sat on the porch. They said the right things. They helped with the cattle for 2 weeks. Then they went home and the help stopped, the way help always stops, and Irene was left with 41 head of cattle, 112 acres, a water line that still needed repairing, and 2 years of operating debt that Kenneth had been managing around without telling her how close the margins actually were. She found out about the margins in February of 1989 when she sat down with the books for the first time since his death and did what Kenneth had always handled himself. She sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. She got up and made coffee. She sat back down. The numbers were not a surprise, exactly. She had known the cattle market was under pressure. Everyone in Calhoun County knew it. $40. Beef prices had been declining in real terms since the mid-1980s, and feed costs had been rising, and the drought years of 1988 and 1989 had pushed supplemental feeding costs to levels that were unsustainable for anyone running fewer than 200 head on irrigated pasture. Irene was running 41 head on dryland coastal prairie. She needed something. She did not know yet what something looked like. Her daughter, Leigh, was 17 in 1989. She was the kind of girl who had been managing the records for the cattle operation since age 13. Not because she had been asked to, but because she liked the numbers, and she was better at them than anyone else in the family. $40. She was also the kind of girl who had not cried when her father died, or had not cried where anyone could see her, and who had instead started doing, with a quiet purposefulness that Irene recognized as grief translated into motion, every physical task on the property that needed doing. Lee had repaired the water line in March of 1989, 300 along. She had done it herself with parts from the farm supply in Victoria, reading the instruction sheet in the parking lot before she drove home. $40 on. She had not asked any questions about the books. She had simply assumed, the way Irene had assumed at the same age when she had watched her own father's face over the kitchen table, that the books were not good and that the time for questions was not now. $40 on. Irene found the reference to Comfrey in the spring of 1990 in an old issue of the Stockman Grass Farmer that Kenneth had kept in a stack beside his recliner and never thrown away. The article was 3 paragraphs long. $40 on. It described a small beef operation in Missouri that had been planting comfrey along fence lines for 15 years and supplementing cattle rations with the leaves during drought periods, when pasture forage dropped below maintenance levels. Or, the article cited a researcher at the University of Missouri named Dr. Opal Reinhold, who had been studying protein content in comfrey leaf for 2 decades and had published data showing crude protein levels of 18 to 24% dry matter, comparable to alfalfa, but with substantially lower water requirements. Irene read the paragraph 4 times, then she read it a 5th time. She set the magazine down on the kitchen table. She picked it up and read it again. He had never heard of comfrey being used as cattle forage. Nobody in Calhoun County had. Comfrey was the thing you grew in a pot on the back porch for poultices. If you were the kind of person who kept a back porch remedy garden, which most cattle ranchers in coastal Texas were not. Comfrey was what her grandmother Hazel had grown beside the back steps and had pressed into a cloth for bruises and sprains. It was not a pasture crop. It was not a ranching tool. $100. It was not anything that belonged in a conversation about beef production costs. She wrote a letter to Dr. Opal Reinhold at the University of Missouri in November of 1990. She explained who she was. She explained what her pastures looked like. She explained the drought problem and the feed cost problem and the protein deficit problem she was seeing in her cattle in late summer when the coastal Bermuda grass dropped off, and before she could justify the cost of supplemental feed. Followers. She asked if comfrey would grow in the sandy loam and clay mix of the coastal prairie. She asked how deep to plant the crowns. She asked whether the cattle could be allowed to graze directly on the plantings, or whether the leaves needed to be cut and fed separately. Dr. Reinhold responded in January of 1991. The response was 8 pages long, typed on university letterhead, with 3 hand-drawn diagrams of root systems and planting spacing. Dr. Reinhold was 61 years old. $300 on. She had spent her career at a university where the primary interest was row crops, and where her own work on perennial forages had been tolerated rather than encouraged, and where she had published 22 papers that had been cited almost entirely by researchers in Europe and New Zealand, because European and New Zealand livestock producers had been using comfrey for 60 years, and American producers had not. $40. She had not, in 22 years of doing this work, received a letter from a working cattle rancher in Texas asking practical questions about planting depth. She answered every question. She included a list of nursery sources for comfrey crowns. She included her phone number. She wrote at the bottom of the last page, "Mrs. Marsh, if you decide to plant, write to me at the end of your first season. I would be glad to hear what happened." Irene drove to a nursery outside San Antonio in late February of 1991 and came home with 300 comfrey crowns in cardboard flats in the bed of Kenneth's truck, which was now her truck, paid for in cash she had taken from the operating account she did not have to spare. She planted them in late March, after the last coastal frost, 3 rows along the north and east fence lines of her main pastures, on a spacing that Dr. Reinhold had specified as optimal for coastal clay soil. The laughing started within 2 weeks. The first person to see the planting was her neighbor to the east, a 62-year-old cattleman named Roy Sutherland, who had farmed 280 acres next to the Marsh property since 1965, and who was not an unkind man, but who had strong opinions about what belonged on a cattle operation and what did not. He pulled over on the county road when he drove past and saw Irene on her knees in the fence-lined dirt with a hand trowel, her daughter Lee hauling a bucket of water behind her. Irene. Roy. What in the world are you putting in? COMFREY. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the rows of small green crowns pressed into the red-brown dirt along the fence post line. What do you mean? That is a garden plant. Plant. It is also a forage plant, high protein, drought tolerant. It will be establishing along this fence line in 60 days and producing cuttable leaf by September. He did not laugh in the fence line ditch. Roy Sutherland was not a man who laughed at a widow on her own property. But he told the story at the Wednesday coffee table at Dottie's Diner within a week. And 3 men at that table laughed, and one of them laughed hard enough that he had to set his coffee cup down. By the end of April, the laugh had made the rounds of the Calhoun County Cattlemen's Association spring meeting. By May, it had reached the elevator in Edna. By June, 2 ranchers, Irene, barely knew had slowed their trucks on the county road to look at the fence line and had driven on without stopping. Horace, who was 73 and arthritic, and who walked out to the main property twice a day to check on things he claimed not to be checking on, came to Irene in the kitchen in the last week of May and sat down across from her at the table. He was a man who used words carefully and not often. Irene. Dad. 300 there is talk. I know there is. People are saying you are making it harder on yourself. She was quiet for a moment. People have been saying that since Kenneth died. That is true. Horace looked at his hands on the tabletop. They were the hands of a man who had run cattle for 50 years. What does the university woman say? It. She says the protein data supports it. She says it establishes in one season and comes back harder every year. She says the root system goes down 4 feet and pulls moisture the Bermuda grass can't reach. He nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. He drank his coffee. Mother's people, Irene. The ones from East Tennessee before they came to Texas. Your great-grandmother kept something called healing herb along her garden fence in Roane County. Your mother told me once that the cattle used to push against the fence in late summer to get at the leaves. I do not know what plant it was. I had forgotten about that until you told me what you were planting. She looked at him. She had not heard this story. I am not saying it is the same thing. He stood up slowly the way he stood up from chairs, now that his knees were what they were. I am saying that the people who are laughing at the Dottie's Diner coffee table on Wednesday mornings have great-great-grandmothers who knew something they have forgotten. You may be remembering it. He walked back to the guest house. He did not bring it up again. The COMFREY established through the summer of 1991. The crowns pushed up their first leaves in April, broad, dark green paddles on hollow stems, rough to the touch, smelling faintly of cucumber and mineral. The cattle ignored them, which was correct, because Irene had reinforced the fence exactly as Dr. Reinhold had specified, $30 on, keeping the animals out of the planting zone for the first full season while the root crowns developed their underground mass. Lee had helped her run the second strand of barbed wire on a Saturday in late March. She was 18 by then. She did not ask questions. She ran the wire. He's on. The neighbors who drove past on the county road in the summer of 1991 saw rows of large-leafed plants they did not recognize, shoulder height by August, running in straight lines along 3 fence borders, of the Marsh property. They did not look like anything that belonged there. The second laugh, which was quieter than the first, started in July at the co-op and made one more round of the Wednesday coffee table before it stopped. First supplemental feeding trial came in August of 1991, when the coastal Bermuda went dormant 2 weeks earlier than normal due to a dry spell that had been building since June. The cattle were showing the beginning signs of protein deficit, the rough coats and slow gains that Irene had seen before, and which always preceded a supplemental feeding bill she could not absorb easily. $40 on, she cut the first COMFREY leaves herself, working along the fence lines in the early morning before the heat came, stacking the cut stems in the bed of the truck. She fed them in the evening, mixed with the regular ration. The cattle ate them. The cattle did not go off feed. The cattle did not show any adverse response. Over the following 3 weeks, the coat quality she had been watching improved measurably. Not dramatically, but measurably. She wrote to Dr. Reinhold. Dr. Reinhold wrote back within 10 days, asking for her feeding logs and her condition scoring notes. She sent them. By the fall of 1991, Irene had been running the property alone for 2.5 years. The books were still not good, but they were less bad than they had been in February of 1989. Feed costs in August and September were down by approximately $280 compared to the same period the previous year, because the COMFREY had covered the protein gap for 3 weeks without requiring her to buy supplemental protein cubes at $14 per 100 pounds. The math was small, but the math was real. She did not tell anyone about the math. She wrote it in the composition book she kept in the kitchen drawer and went on. $100 on. The drought of 1993 was the first real test. It was a drought that started in May and did not break until October, the kind that Calhoun County remembered for decades afterward. The kind where the pastures went to brown dust by July and the cattle auction in Edna filled up with ranchers selling down their herds to reduce pressure on pastures that could no longer support them. Irene sold 8 head in June. She did not sell more because the COMFREY was still green. The COMFREY was still green in July. The COMFREY was still green in August. The root crowns had, by 1993, full years, been in the ground for 2 full years and had sent taproots down to a depth that Irene could not accurately measure, but that Dr. Reinhold had predicted would reach subsoil moisture that the Bermuda grass had no access to. The leaves came back within a week of each cutting, regardless of the heat, as long as she left 4 inches of stem above the crown. He was cutting 3 times a week by late July. The cattle were holding weight. Corey Sutherland lost 14 head in the summer of 1993 to the combination of drought-induced weight loss and the supplemental feed costs required to maintain the rest of his herd. He drove past the marsh fence lines in August and slowed down without stopping. The COMFREY along Irene's east border was green and upright in the afternoon heat. His own fence lines were bare. He did not stop, he drove on. Lee came home from the University of Houston in the summer of 1993 for 6 weeks, and she worked the property every day from 5 in the morning until dark. She was 20 now, studying accounting. $40 on. She had not decided yet whether she was coming back to the property after graduation, and she had not told Irene either way, and Irene had not asked, because Irene believed that the decision a grown child makes about their own life is not a decision a parent ought to rush. But Lee walked the fence lines every morning with a measuring tape and a notebook, measuring leaf regeneration rates and calculating cutting yields with the same focused attention she had brought to the cattle records at 13. She was not doing it for her mother. She was doing it because the numbers interested her. "Mom," she said one evening, standing at the kitchen counter with the composition book open. $300. yen. If you extended the planting to the south pasture fence lines and added 2 rows along the windbreak on the west side, you would have enough comfrey leaf in a bad summer to carry the herd through 6 weeks without any supplemental purchase. The drought years are the expensive years. The COMFREY eliminates the drought premium on your feed costs. Irene was quiet for a moment. She looked at her daughter. Lee had Kenneth's habit of standing with her weight on her left foot when she was working through a problem. It was the kind of thing you noticed when someone was no longer there. "No," she said. "I have been thinking about the expansion since last spring." "Why haven't you done it?" "Because I am not sure the farm is what you want it to be." Lee was quiet. She looked at the composition book. She looked out the kitchen window at the fence line, where the comfrey was dark against the evening light. "Come on, that is not the right question," she said finally. "The right question is whether the farm is what you want it to be." "What do you mean?" Irene did not answer that directly. She made tea. They sat at the kitchen table. They did not talk about the farm for the rest of the evening. $400 on. The years 1994 and 1995 were the years the Calhoun County cattle market came apart at the margins. Beef prices in 1994 fell to levels that made the already thin margins of small operations simply non-existent. The first closure was a 95-acre operation near Seadrift that had been in the same family since 1941. $40 on. The second was a 140-acre ranch outside Tivoli, whose owner had been managing the debt since 1988 and had finally stopped managing it. By the end of 1995, 6 operations within 15 miles of Irene's property had either sold their cattle or sold their land or both. Irene's operation was not making money. It was not losing money at the rate it had been losing it before the COMFREY, which was a different thing, but not a comfortable thing. She had, by 1995, reduced feed cost exposure in late summer drought periods to near zero, which had improved her annual net by approximately $2,200 compared to her 1989 baseline. And she was still running on margins that left no room for a bad equipment year or a vet bill above a certain amount. She told Horace the numbers in October of 1995, sitting on his back porch in the last of the afternoon light. He was 77. He listened without saying anything until she had finished. "What do you mean?" he said. "Dr. Reinhold, has she ever visited the property?" "No." "What you told her about the drought year results?" "I sent her the feeding logs every summer." He was quiet for a moment. "Does she know what you have here?" $40, she knows the data. He looked out across the back of the property, toward the fence line where the COMFREY stood in the October light, brown-edged now as the season turned, but still there, still rooted, waiting for spring. "What do you mean?" he said. "I think you should ask her to come." $40 on. She had been thinking about the same thing for 6 months. She had not raised it because she had not been sure how to ask a 65-year-old university researcher to drive to coastal Texas to look at a fence line planting that was $40 by the standards of the academic literature, a small and informal operation. Dr. Reinhold had published papers on research plots with controlled inputs and measured outputs. What Irene had was 3 fence lines and a composition book. She wrote the letter the next morning. She mailed it in Port Lavaca. She did not tell anyone she had written it. Dr. Opal Reinhold responded in November of 1995. The response was 4 pages. It said, among other things, that she had been reviewing Irene's feeding logs for 4 seasons, and that the summer drought data Irene had reported in 1993 was, in her careful academic phrasing, the most significant field observation she had received in 15 years of working on this plant with American livestock operations. $40 on. It said that she would like very much to come to Seadrift in March of 1996 to see the planting. It said she would cover her own travel. $4. It also included a paragraph that Irene read twice before she put the letter down. $40. Mrs. Marsh, the data you have been sending me represents something I have been trying to demonstrate in controlled settings for 20 years. The difficulty with perennial forage research is that the results only become meaningful across multiple drought cycles, and controlled research plots are not held for 20 years. Your fence lines have been held. Do you not know another cattlewoman in Texas who has done what you have done here, which is to hold a planting through a bad drought year on the basis of data she read in a magazine and a letter from a researcher she had never met? I want to see what you have built. Dr. Reinhold arrived on March 4, 1996. She was 66, shorter than Irene had expected, with gray hair cut practically short and boots that were clearly not new. She spent the first morning walking every fence line with a measuring tape and a soil probe. She took samples. She took photographs. Dollars on. She sat at Irene's kitchen table for 2 hours with the composition book and read every entry Irene had written since 1991, asking questions about specific notations in the feeding logs, with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting a long time to ask them. She stayed for 5 days. Fourth day, she drove with Irene to Corpus Christi, where she had arranged a meeting with a feed additive supplier named Marcus Hensley, who ran a regional livestock nutrition business and who had been, for the past 3 years, watching the organic and natural beef certification market develop with the interest of someone who had supply relationships but not the product variety to serve it fully. The natural beef market in 1996 was small but growing. It was concentrated in cities. It was being driven by buyers who were willing to pay a premium for cattle raised without synthetic protein supplementation, which was exactly the thing that COMFREY, fed as a natural leaf supplement, could replace. Marcus Hensley listened to Dr. Reinhold. He listened to Irene. He looked at the photographs of the fence line plantings and the summer drought performance data from 1993. He asked 3 questions. Mrs. Marsh, what is your current herd size? 43 head. $40 on. If you expanded the COMFREY planting to cover your full property fence perimeter and converted to natural certification, what would your annual leaf production support? $100 on. Irene had done this calculation in February. It would support supplemental feeding for 45 to 50 head through a 6-week drought period with no synthetic input. Me on. He nodded. At 32 cents per pound premium on certified natural beef, and assuming your current slaughter weight, your per animal net would increase by approximately $68. On 50 head, that is $3,400 annually. It would be more in drought years when your uncertified competitors' feed costs rise and yours do not. He paused. Mrs. Marsh, I have been looking for a working demonstration property for the natural beef program I am building in this region. What I need is a property that can show the protocol in action, not just the concept. What you have along those fence lines is the only thing I have seen in 4 years of looking that is actually working in a coastal Texas context. I would like to talk about a supply relationship. Dollars on. Irene did not answer immediately. She looked at Dr. Reinhold, who was watching her with the neutral expression of a researcher who knows better than to influence a farmer's business decision. Then she looked back at Marcus Hensley. 14, she said, I will need to expand the planting first. The current fence lines support the existing herd. I would need 2 more seasons to build production capacity for a supply commitment. He said, 2 seasons is acceptable. They shook hands. Dr. Reinhold and Irene drove back to Seadrift in the late afternoon. The Gulf light was flat and silver on the water visible between the live oaks. Dr. Reinhold said nothing for the first 20 miles. Then she said, You just described a farm that your cattle market has been telling you does not exist. Irene said. My father told me about the healing herb my great-grandmother kept in Tennessee. Reinhold turned to look at her. She came to Texas. She kept it along the fence, and the cattle pushed through to get at the leaves in late summer. Nobody here could tell me what plant it was. I looked it up after I read your work. Symphytum officinale, common comfrey, the same plant. Reinhold was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, the way a researcher says something when it confirms what she has believed for a long time. They always knew. Somebody always knew. First certified natural beef sale from the Marsh operation came in October of 1996. Lee had come home for that month. She had graduated in May and had taken a position with an accounting firm in Houston that she liked well enough, but had not decided to keep. She helped Irene with the expansion planting that fall, the two of them setting crowns along the south pasture and the west windbreak fence in the October heat, working in the early morning and the late afternoon to avoid the midday sun. One evening, near the end of the month, sitting on the back porch after the work was done, Lee said, I want to come back. Irene did not ask why. She had learned not to ask the questions whose answers were already clear. I have been looking at the numbers since I got here, Lee said. With the natural certification and the Hensley contract, and if we expand the herd back to 45 head by spring, the operation is profitable by 1998. Not barely profitable, actually profitable. The COMFREY eliminates the drought year losses that have been the margin killer every 4 years for as long as I can find in Dad's books. Irene looked out at the back of the property, at the fence lines running south in the last light. The COMFREY was brown now with the season, but the crowns were in the ground. They would be back in March. Lee, she said, if you come back, it will not always be easy. 100 on, I know that. The market will move again. There will be years. Han, I know that too. Irene was quiet for a moment. Irene was quiet for a moment. Your father would have been glad, she said. He would have been hard to live with about it, because that is how he was about things he was glad about. But he would have been glad. Lee made a sound that was almost a laugh. They sat in the dark for a while. Fallon. Roy Sutherland stopped in the driveway of the Marsh property on a Saturday morning in May of 1998. He had not stopped at the property since before Kenneth died. He had not found a way to stop earlier. Dollars on. He sat in his truck at the end of the driveway for a long time, watching the fence lines, which were thick now and uniform, the COMFREY 4 feet tall already in the late spring, deep green along the borders of 3 pastures. He got out. He walked to the kitchen porch. Irene came to the door. Roy. Irene. He took off his hat and held it. I owe you something. You do not owe me anything, Roy. You the admission that I was wrong. He said it plainly, without ornamentation. The way a man says something he has been carrying for years and has finally decided to put down. I have been watching this property for 7 years. I laughed at what you were doing in 1991. I told people about it and I let them laugh too. I was wrong about what it was. I was wrong about what you were. Irene was quiet. She had not been waiting for this exactly, but she had known that it was moving toward her the way some things move slowly and arrive when they are ready. Boy, she said, come in, I will make coffee. Riesman. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. Lee came in from the back porch where she had been working on the accounts, and Roy looked at her for a long moment, and then looked down at the table, because Lee had Kenneth's eyes, and he had known Kenneth for 30 years. They talked for 2 hours. Roy admitted that he had sold 12 head in the summer of 1993 because his feed costs had been unsupportable. He admitted that he had driven past the east fence line of the Marsh property on 2 mornings that same summer, and had seen the comfrey standing green in a drought that was killing everything else, and had not stopped. $100 on. He admitted that not stopping had been a kind of refusal he could not entirely explain, except that it is very hard for a man to look directly at the thing he was wrong about. Irene accepted what he said. She poured a second cup of coffee. She did not ask him to account for anything more than he had already offered. $100 on. He came back the following month with his wife, Ellen, and a bag of homegrown okra from Ellen's garden. He came back the month after that. By the fall of 1999, he was helping Lee with the south pasture fence line maintenance twice a month, which was not something anyone had asked him to do. He had simply started doing it, the way people sometimes begin to repair things without being told to. $100 on. The community's relationship with the Marsh property changed slowly in the years that followed. The co-op in Port Lavaca began stocking comfrey crowns in 2001, $300, on the basis of 4 separate requests from ranchers in the county who had seen the Marsh operation and wanted to try it. Dr. Reinhold published a paper in 2002 that cited Irene's feeding logs from 1991 through 1999 as the longest field data series on comfrey supplementation in a commercial Texas beef operation ever recorded. She drove back to Seadrift that same year to deliver a copy to Irene in person. She stayed for 3 days. Curtis died in April of 2003 at age 85. He died in his sleep in the guest house at the back of the property that he had moved into in 1984 and had never wanted to leave. His funeral was held at the First Baptist Church in Seadrift, which he had attended most of his life, with the loose regularity of a man who believed in what the church stood for without always agreeing with what it said. Roy Sutherland carried one end of the casket. He had become, in the 4 years since his morning on the kitchen porch, one of Horace's only regular visitors. They had sat on the back porch of the guest house on Sunday afternoons and talked about cattle and weather, and the condition of things, the way men of their generation talk when they have run out of a need to impress each other. $300. Lee ran the Marsh operation from 2003 forward, with Irene still present and walking the fence lines every morning until 2019, when she was 71 and her knees had become what they had become, the way knees always become something in the end on a working property. She moved into the guest house at the back of the property in 2019 and let Lee manage the daily operation the way Horace had managed the transition in 1984. With the quiet confidence of someone who knows the land is in the right hands. Lee had married a man named Thomas Greer in 2005, an engineer from Victoria, a civil engineer from Victoria who had grown up on a farm in DeWitt County and who had moved to Seadrift and built a new packing facility for the Comfrey leaf supply operation, which had become by 2008 the primary revenue driver for the property. The natural beef herd had stabilized at 52 head. The comfrey planting covered 4 acres of fence line across the property. The combined operation was clearing a net that Irene had, in her calculation at the kitchen table in 1989, believed was permanently out of reach. Curtis Hensley retired from his livestock nutrition business in 2010 and sent Irene a letter on the occasion. The letter said, among other things, $1 that the Marsh operation had been the demonstration model for 7 other natural beef certifications in the region, and that the Comfrey protocol she had developed had been adopted in some form by all 7. He said he was sorry he had not come looking for what she had built sooner. $300 on. He said he thought the Comfrey had been waiting for her, the way some solutions wait for the person, with the patience to see them. Lee's daughter, Joanna, was born in 2007. By the time she was 9, she was walking the fence lines with Irene in the early mornings during summer visits, asking questions in the way that children ask questions when they are actually listening to the answers. Irene answered them. She answered them precisely, the way Dr. Calhoun Reinhold had answered her questions in 1991, because she had learned from that correspondence that a precise answer to a real question is one of the more valuable things one person can give to another. $100 on. Joanna, Irene said one morning in the summer of 2022, when her granddaughter was 15 and the comfrey along the east fence was up to her shoulder. 300, yes, Grandma. In your great-great-grandmother in East Tennessee. She kept this plant along her fence line 150 years ago. Omana looked at the fence line. She was a quiet girl who processed things before she responded, the same way her mother had always processed things. What do you know? It was the same plant. Did he not know it for certain? Irene walked with her along the row, the way she had walked it for 30 years. Your grandfather Horace remembered his mother-in-law telling a story about a healing herb that the cattle pushed through the fence for in late summer. I found the botanical name, and it matched. It is a circumstantial case, not a proven one. But you believe it. I believe that the women who kept farms in East Tennessee in the 1870s knew what their cattle needed in late summer and planted accordingly, and that the knowledge traveled with the family to Texas and then got lost somewhere between Roane County and Calhoun County, and that I found it again by accident in a magazine in 1990. I believe that is not entirely an accident. Tallerzon, Joanna, thought about that for a moment, walking in the shadow of the comfrey rose. 100, Grandma. Are there other plants like that, things the old farmers knew that we stopped knowing? Irene was quiet for a moment. The Gulf wind came across the coastal prairie from the southeast, the way it always came in the morning before the heat built. The comfrey moved in it, the broad, dark leaves turning slightly, the way they had turned in every summer wind for 30 years. Yes, she said. I believe there are, and I believe most of them are still there, waiting in someone's fence line memory, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough trouble to go looking. Often, they walked to the end of the row. Joanna wrote something in the small notebook she had started carrying that summer. Irene did not ask what she wrote. She did not need to ask. She recognized the notebook. $14 on. I keep thinking about that morning Roy Sutherland sat in his truck at the end of Irene's driveway for 10 minutes before he could bring himself to get out. 10 minutes is a long time to sit with something you got wrong. What strikes me about Irene's story is not that she was right and everyone else was wrong. That part is almost beside the point. What strikes me is the sequence of things she did before anyone believed her. She read 4 sentences in an old magazine. She wrote a letter to a stranger at a university. She drove to a nursery and spent money she did not have. She planted 300 crowns in the Texas dirt in late March and then reinforced the fence and waited. She did all of that before she had a single piece of evidence that it would work. That is not luck. That is a specific kind of clear-eyed thinking that most people confuse with stubbornness. There is a cause and effect chain running through everything Irene did, and if you trace it back far enough, it starts not with the comfrey but with the composition book. She kept records. She sent feeding logs to Dr. Reinhold every summer for 4 years. She measured her cattle condition scores and wrote them down. When the drought of 1993 came, she did not have a feeling that the comfrey was working. She had data. The difference between a feeling and data is the difference between Roy Sutherland's 14 head going to auction and Irene's herd holding weight through the same summer. The honest thinking she brought to the problem is what made the solution visible in the first place. And then there is Lee, 18 years old, running barbed wire on a Saturday morning without being asked. Lee, repairing the water line from an instruction sheet in a parking lot. Lee, standing at the kitchen counter with the composition book, doing the math her father had not lived to do. I think about what it cost that girl to carry that kind of weight at that age. And I think about what it gave her too. 41. The children who are asked by circumstance to show up before they are ready sometimes become the people who never stop showing up. That is not a comfortable truth, but I believe it is a true one. What Irene did required all three things, and they were not separable. The integrity to hold her course when the community was laughing and her savings were draining. That kept her in the game long enough for the COMFREY to prove itself. The clear thinking to read 4 sentences and ask the right questions and keep the right records. That turned a hunch into something real. And the endurance to work those fence lines through drought years and bad prices and the specific loneliness of doing something no one around you understands. That is what carried the whole thing from 1991 to 1998. Roy eventually understood what he had been wrong about. The community eventually came back. Dr. Reinhold eventually published the data, but none of that happened first. It happened after. The farm did not survive because people came around. People came around because the farm survived. The COMFREY was in the ground for 7 years before it saved anything. 7 years of green leaves along a fence that people drove past and shook their heads at. The roots were going deeper the whole time, pulling moisture from ground no one else could reach. Some things work that way.